Helen, can you hear me good at this volume?
Hello and welcome to today's training, PTSD from Cells to Communities with Dr. Kerry Ressler, MD and PhD. I am Helen Heyman, Director of Programs at ADAA. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. We will first kindly ask you to mute yourself so that we don't hear any background noise. To mute yourself, you will need to press the gray tab just below the red arrow. Kindly also switch off your webcam. The webcam tab is just below the mute tab. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat panel of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. You will also be able to access materials. If you registered and paid for continuing education credit, you will first need to provide the 4-letter CE code on the webinar evaluation form. The link to the evaluation form in SurveyMonkey will be sent to you 48 hours after the end of the professional webinar. You can either answer the post-assessment questions at the end of this webinar by staying online. The assessment questions will appear at the very end of the presentation. A screen will come up with the questions. You will have 5 minutes to answer the questions. You can answer them and click Submit. I would like to now introduce our expert. Dr. Kerry Ressler, medical doctor and PhD, is a professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School and the James and Patricia Poitras Chair in Psychiatry, Chief Scientific Officer and Chief of the Division of Depression and Anxiety Disorders at McLean Hospital. Dr. Ressler began this role in August 2015 after serving at Emory University in Atlanta for 18 years. Dr. Ressler is also the 2017 president of the U.S. Society for Biological Psychiatry. He received his Bachelor's of Science degree in molecular biology from MIT and his MD PhD from Harvard Medical School. In 1992 at Harvard, Dr. Ressler was the first student of Dr. Linda Buck, Nobel Prize in 2004, helping to identify the molecular organization of the olfactory receptor system. Dr. Ressler is a previous investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and a current member of the National Academy of Medicine, formerly the IOM. His work focuses on translational research, bridging molecular neurobiology in animal models with human genetic research on emotion, particularly fear and anxiety disorders. Dr. Ressler has published over 250 manuscripts ranging from basic molecular mechanisms of fear processing to understanding how emotion is encoded in a region of the brain called the amygdala in both animal models and human patients. It is a true honor and pleasure to work with Dr. Ressler. I will now pass the screen over to him.
Thanks so much, Helen, and it's delightful to be part of the ADAA webinar series. Let's see, I think we're on, but Helen or Kim will let me know if this isn't working.
Yes.
Okay, great. I've been a member of ADAA, the Anxiety and Depression Association, for a couple decades now, and it's just a wonderful organization, and I'm delightful to be part of the educational series, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. The talk I'm going to give today is really spanning the work that myself and my colleagues, a whole host of people, including Tanya Yovanovitch, Beck Bradley, Ricky Gillespie, Vas Mikopoulos, and many others that I'll name as we go, have been involved with at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta through Emory University. And then really trying to bridge the question and issues of inner city and urban violence and trauma to what we know about the molecular, cellular, and genetic mechanisms of post-traumatic stress and trauma. And the real take-home message, if you don't take anything else, is that PTSD is treatable, and that a medical model approach to understanding risk and resilience and PTSD in our urban areas of high violence and cycles of violence may be a unique and powerful approach to helping with this critical problem. So the first slide is just my disclosure slide. I've been involved in a number of advisory boards, received funding from a variety of foundations, and have patents related to some work, none of which will be talked about specifically in the talk today. The overview and outline of my talk is as follows. I'm going to first give you sort of the basis of how we currently think about the fear processing in the mammalian brain and why understanding fear is critical, we think, to understanding disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder and other trauma-related disorders. Then I'm going to walk into an area that's we know is comorbid, but try to give you a little bit better example of why there's a biological comorbidity, and that's the intersection of trauma and PTSD with both risk for substance abuse and cycles of violence, making the argument that these are all part and parcel of similar risk in some communities. Then I'll dive back into some of the biology of fear and PTSD. Through this, I'll weave some examples put together by Tanya Ivanovich and our team on cases, examples of risk and resilience that will help point out at an individual case study level how these things are interacting. And through all of this, you'll hear the theme of childhood trauma as one of the biggest risk factors for many psychiatric disorders, and certainly for PTSD and depression. And I'll talk from there some about the developmental components of this, how some of these findings may lead to next generation treatments, and how all of this can lead to perhaps increased improvement and new approaches to thinking about the impact of stress, risk, and poverty on our communities. So to start with, an overview of fear and PTSD. So this is a classic slide I generally start with from Joe Ledoux, and it reminds us that fear is a neurobiologically evolved and maintained process that is critical for our survival. And what you can imagine is this gentleman walking through the woods, and he's enjoying himself, and out of the corner of his eye he sees a snake-like object, activates a whole fight or flight system, and within hundreds of milliseconds he is backed up, his heart's racing, his pupils are dilated, he's sweating, he's breathing fast, and he's really on edge to escape. And then at that point he realizes, oh, that was just a stick. And what's going on there is that the very first pre-processed visual information from the eyes within a synapse or two is at this visual thalamus. And in parallel with the visual thalamus sending information to the sensory cortices, in this case the visual cortex, it also sends information to the amygdala. So while the amygdala, which I'll tell you a lot more about, is involved in activating the fight or flight survival system within tens to hundreds of milliseconds of this snake-like visual object, the visual processing in the cortex is breaking down in dorsal and ventral modes what this figure looks like. It's then sending that information to higher order cortices, and then, you know, half a second or a second later, the brain starts to then consciously become aware that this in fact is a stick and not a snake. But long before that, the amygdala has already activated the whole body fight or flight system. Well, that's great for survival, but in our current disorders and in a current world in which we're more likely to be injured by trauma, by our fellow man, and by other incidents than we are by the predators that we evolved to escape from, our fear systems tend to cause more harm than good. And post-traumatic stress is an example of a disorder that can really be characterized with fear as a critical component. Of course, PTSD is associated with anxiety, with memory alterations, and a number of other components, but I'll be talking mostly about the fear system. This is a slide from Tanya Ivanovich, which really nicely also reminds us that another reason why post-traumatic stress and stress-related disorders are particularly interesting to focus on from a biological and clinical perspective is that they really are the epitome of gene-by-environment interactions. And most disorders in psychiatry we can really think of as being partly genetic and inherited and partly environmental. But PTSD, because we know when it starts, by definition it is time-stamped as the initial point of trauma, that gives us power in the gene by environment approach that we don't necessarily have in other disorders. And I'll talk some about where we are as a field in terms of understanding neurobiological intermediate phenotypes, in that PTSD is not one thing, just like our other psychiatric disorders are not. There are likely a number of intermediate phenotypes associated with fear processing, startle processing, differential brain activation, as well as other components of PTSD, dissociation, guilt, shame, many of the other complex aspects of PTSD. The work I'm going to be talking about is related to the role of PTSD in our civilian populations. Most people think about PTSD related to the military, but in fact, work from ourselves and others have shown that in certain communities in America, including big cities like Atlanta, Detroit, Chicago, New York, LA, go on, our rates of post-traumatic stress can be as high or higher than. So what is PTSD? Again, it's defined epidemiologically. It's clinically very important. It's up to 10% of the population. Most estimates are around 6 or 7% of lifetime PTSD, though it can be higher current. But amongst highly traumatized populations, including combat veterans and traumatized civilians, it can be as high as 25%. And again, some studies, including our work in inner city Atlanta, have suggested that our rates of PTSD may be even higher than 25%. And as I'll walk through, it's amenable to study. We know when it starts. It shares a conserved neural circuitry of the fear system that I'll be talking more about. And it's related to learning and memory, brain plasticity, an area that's a great deal is known about. As far as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5 criteria, criterion A is that the person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, actual or threatened sexual violence. Note that it used to, DSM-4, we explicitly had the comment of the subjective component of feeling of sense of overwhelming fear, sense of death, hopelessness, and those subjective components have been removed, but for a number of reasons we can talk about if you're interested in the discussion. But from the scientific perspective, it is clear that most patients with PTSD talk about dysregulated fear as one of their critical components. The other symptoms are criterion B, intrusive symptoms, again, re-experiencing the traumatic event, often through nightmares and flashbacks, and the people with PTSD experience this as if it's happening right then, and they're as afraid of it as if it's real in the moment. Avoidance symptoms, and again, in the Pavlovian sense, avoidance is a very natural approach to something one is afraid of. The problem with PTSD is people avoid and avoid and avoid, essentially have a habit of avoidance and can't then re-expose themselves for recovery. It's also involved in negative alterations in cognition and mood, and this is one of the new components of DSM-5. And the positives of this is it brings in some of the comorbid components of the depression aspects and the decreased cognitive aspects, as well as numbing and some of the dissociative aspects. The negative side is it makes it even harder sometimes to discriminate depression from PTSD, which are highly comorbid. And finally, symptoms of increased arousal, the decreased sleep, the startle, the hyperarousal, hypervigilance, irritability, and decreased concentration. Many of these can be thought of, as I'll show you later, as parts of the specific fear response system that is really dysregulated in patients with PTSD. Take home, people with PTSD often live as if experience life as if they're going through the original trauma over and over and over again, even though it's historical. Their present conscious mind can't separate the past trauma from the present. So the first point I wanted to make was the observation that PTSD is also a risk factor for aggressive behavior. And the reason this is important is, I think what the ethical issue here is, how do you not blame the victim? And I want to flip it on its head, in which saying that if we have communities in which PTSD, untreated PTSD is part of the problem, this actually contributes to the cycles of violence that I think then contribute to the next generations PTSD. And by having a medical model approach as opposed to a punitive approach to PTSD in our criminal justice system, I think we could make a big difference. This is a paper led by Sachika Donnelly along with collaborators at Grady, and I'll show you the data in a minute. But one of the case study points that I wanted to bring up here was a gentleman who was interviewed for this study. He's a 45-year-old man, multiple arrests, prison time, multiple lifetime trauma exposures. And he was quoted as saying, "I forget initially why I became aggressive. I realized that the aggression I used then, it helped me to establish a sort of fear amongst others." And so they say something like, I ain't going to mess with him. They labeled me crazy, and crazy was to get me out of it or protect me. But I wasn't crazy. I was tough. I was scared. And only I knew that I was the only one who knew I was scared. So what I'm going to do, because it worked before, I'm going to do something really extreme to scare people off. So he had great insight into basically his defensive aggression that protected him when he was scared all the time. And he said a lot of guys would say, I'm tired, I'm not coming back, but I see them all coming back to prison. And I knew they were sincere. I sat there and I looked in their eyes, and he said to me, crying, "I'm so tired of this. I've been doing this all my life." And then he'd go home, but then he'd come back again. What happened? I asked, well, being sick and tired is not enough to keep you out. You have to know what keeps bringing you back, why you keep coming back. So it was a remarkably insightful gentleman who'd been through so much in the prison system and in his community, and certainly he, acknowledged that he did a lot of bad things that that for which there was issues, but he'd never been treated for PTSD, which one could argue was the core of some of what he was going through. Data from Sachiko's paper showed that in a community sample of people attending Grady Memorial Hospital in general waiting rooms, this wasn't a psychiatric population and it wasn't a criminal population, it was just a community sample of people attending a large inner city hospital for an impoverished community, found that arrest risk was much higher in those with PTSD compared to those without. Those jailed were higher, imprisonment was higher, and charges involved in violence were all very high, very significant, and very high chi-squareds. Similarly, if we looked at history of childhood and adult trauma, history of both trauma types were associated with increased arrest, increased jail, imprisonment, and charges involving violence. We showed, and Sachiko showed, a number of other associations, but then the take-home message was, when she did a stepwise regression analysis, saying, I'm going to control for everything I can in this at-risk population. Again, this is a cohort of 3,600 folks from inner city Atlanta, controlling for demographic information, trauma history, PTSD, had an overall significance in the model, and after controlling for most of the risk factors that we could think of, that we had data on: sex, knowing that females are more at risk, age, race, education, employment, income, all of which are associated with differential risk, as well as substance abuse and childhood trauma and adult trauma. Controlling for all of that, PTSD symptoms alone still had a strongly significant, less than 0.001 association with charges of violent behavior. And so the summary there is PTSD symptoms were associated with significantly more charges of offenses even after controlling for all these things. And the reason this is important is we know we can treat PTSD. We know how to treat PTSD. If we could do this in communities, if we could do this in jails and prison, would this help us to stop the cycles of violence? Another component that's a problem in our communities is substance abuse. And we know that substance abuse is highly associated with trauma, childhood trauma, adult trauma, and PTSD. And this is just another piece of data led by Lamia Corey and others from the group, and Joe Kubels and Yulin Tang, that childhood trauma measured with the early trauma inventory, increasing, and this is like the ACE measures and it's like the CTQ measures, increasing rates of childhood trauma were associated with much greater risk of alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, heroin. And again, we see this over and over. But again, from a hopeful perspective, there's a concept of resilience, and there are many different ways of measuring resilience. One way of measuring resilience is that those who have risk but don't have the pathology. Another way of measuring resilience is a specific measure. This is using the Connor-Davidson resiliency score. Elisa Wingo and Beck Bradley looked at those with high resilience versus low resilience, looking at the audit score for alcohol and the DAS score for drug abuse in about 2,000 people. And what they found was, if we look at the low resilient population, we found the overall pattern that we see over and over again. More child abuse is more alcohol and more drug abuse. But this orthogonal measure of resilience was associated with essentially a flat line. They were protected from the child abuse measures on alcohol and drug abuse. And there's increasing evidence that we can train resilience, whether that be through things like DBT therapies, other sorts of therapies, as well as what we can do in the communities. But if we could help train resilience in our in early ages in our at-risk kids and our at-risk communities, that can make a big difference. Okay, back to the biology of fear and PTSD. So most people are familiar with the concept of a panic attack. People would say, all of a sudden I felt dizzy, my legs gave out on me, couldn't catch my breath, someone was choking me. Have all these senses of increased heart rate, stress, GI distress, shortness of breath, etc. And we actually see a panic attack in all the anxiety disorders. Most people think of panic attack with the term panic disorder, and that's because in that case it seems like the panic is coming out of the blue. Though most of us who've seen panic attack patients, when you ask them when it first started, it was often at a time of high depression or stress after a trauma, etc. But their brain is wired in a way that we don't understand, that instead of associating the panic attack with the symptoms and the context and the cues that were triggering them for the panic attack, the fear attack, they instead associated the bodily symptoms, all of these symptoms, with what they should be afraid of. So the next time they felt sweaty, they then had the cue trigger that, oh, I may have another panic attack, I need to get out of here, maybe it's this place, and thus develops the cycle of agoraphobia and increasing basically fear of fear. Simple phobia, if you're afraid of spiders and a spider lands on you, you have all these symptoms. You may call it scared to death, but it looks like the same symptoms as a panic attack. And with PTSD, the triggers, the reminders of the prior traumas are the cues. And the reason that is such an interesting thing for me, the symptoms of a panic attack, is that these were identified and have observed by clinicians over many decades and have really been pretty consistent in the literature for half a century. In parallel with that observation of this is what a panic attack, the field of amygdala neurobiology developed the following map, and this is from altered from a figure from Michael Davis, who was my postdoc advisor, and he was one of the leaders along with Joe Ledoux and Mike Fanzelo and others in understanding the circuitry of the amygdala and the basic fear circuitry. And what we now know is the amygdala, whether it's in a mouse or in a human, has hardwired outputs to a whole host of brainstem targets that then lead upon activation of the amygdala to the pretty much exact same set of symptoms and responses, behavioral responses that we see with the panic attack. So that it's one of the few places in psychiatry where we know a specific brain region with a specific hardwired set of circuitry lead, if you will, to a fear reflex that leads to a behavior that looks to us like a complex behavior, but it can be thought of as a reflex. And in some people with PTSD, this fear reflex essentially gets out of control or is easily triggered. There are probably many kinds of PTSDs. There are probably some in which the people are maybe overly learn the fear in the first place, others in which it's hard to inhibit the fear at a later time point, others in which it's hard to discriminate and they overgeneralize, et cetera, et cetera. But we have a handle on at least one part of the circuitry of PTSD. And again, the amygdala lies in the temporal lobe in front of the hippocampus, which is involved in the contextualization. And we know the orbitofrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex is involved in top-down regulation of the amygdala and hippocampus. And now a whole host is known about the different nuclei that are involved in pairing the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. Say, having a car accident, that then the next time the person is in a car, even not having an accident, that acts as a cue to remind and activate the fear signal for the person who's afraid of driving or who may have PTSD related to a motor vehicle accident. So again, we know three of the main players are the amygdala as the final common output, the hippocampus, which seems to regulate the amygdala and regulate the contextualization and extinction, and a lot of data suggests, led initially by Doug Bremner and replicated in many studies, and most recently by the Psychiatric Genomic Consortium group led by a group at Duke, shows that smaller hippocampal volumes associated with PTSD and that top-down regulation from medial prefrontal cortex is just decreased in PTSD. One of the other interesting observations as we think about why substance abuse might be correlated and comorbid with PTSD is the recognition that they actually share many of the same circuits. George Koob, who's really been a leader in this field for a long time and is now the director of NIAAA, talks about the dark side of addiction and the idea that the initial components of intoxication involved the most classic parts of the circuitry involved in appetitive behavior like the striatum, the ventral tegmental area, the dopaminergic systems, but that other aspects are involved in other components that are just as important in addiction. And the negative side of withdrawal from alcohol and substances of abuse, and the negative feelings and the crashing and all of that are right in the middle of the same circuits that we talk about with PTSD, the amygdala, the BNST, and its projections. And both of these are regulated by medial prefrontal and orbitofrontal and hippocampal systems that regulate all of the positive and negative valence systems, so that when we have dysregulation of the medial prefrontal cortex following trauma, so that the medial prefrontal cortex can't suppress the amygdala to suppress the fear, in parallel, it can't suppress the accumbens to suppress the addictive components. And so they're now starting to come together to understand that the same brain regions are involved in excitement and addiction, and that dysregulation, whether it's addiction that comes first or PTSD that comes first, sets one up biologically for a greater risk than for comorbid addiction or PTSD. Okay, so to our case examples. Miss A622 was a 33-year-old female, again from our study in Atlanta. From the age of 6, she had sustained severe physical and emotional abuse by her father and repeated sexual abuse by her stepbrother. And she currently had significant symptoms of PTSD. So our next example, 8543, and we'll follow both of these over the course of the talk, had similar levels of trauma, but I'll show you at the end, seemed to have a more resilient trajectory. Until age 7, she lived with her mother and her father, who were addicted to crack cocaine. She witnessed a number of violent fights between her parents. At age 8, she moved in with her grandmother. While still living with her parents, she was exposed to neighborhood violence, including one specific example. At 7 years old, there was a shootout between her neighbors, which unfortunately happened relatively commonly. In this one, shots came through the windows, breaking the glass, and she dropped on the floor in the living room trying to protect her and her younger siblings. And she had very strong memories of this, and she also met PTSD for this trauma. Okay, so the Grady Trauma Project, again led by a whole host of wonderful collaborators at Grady Memorial Hospital at Emory University. It's over the last 2 decades, has enrolled over 12,000 subjects, and when we had 500 subjects and now that we have 12,000 subjects, we see similar demographics. About almost everybody is below the poverty level. About half, or maybe a little less than half, know somebody personally who's been murdered, whether that's a family member or a friend. 2/3 themselves have been attacked physically or with a weapon. 2/3 have experienced some form of, particularly the females, have experienced some sort of sexual assault, and 1/3 have experienced some sort of significant childhood trauma. So a very highly traumatized population. And the rates of PTSD, as I'll show you, are as high as in our military cohorts. This slide from Beck Bradley from GTP shows really the different kinds of trauma exposure that we see in males in blue, females in red, females tend to have had more physical and sexual assaults, males tend to have more witnessing weapons and physical assaults. Interestingly, we see greater rates of natural disaster reporting than we often would see in a general middle-class population. And this was hard for us to get our head around until we started realizing that things like floods, tornadoes, and fires, while they don't happen any more frequently, although fires may because of poor fire codes, may not happen that much more frequently in impoverished populations. If you have very little resources when these things happen, you don't have insurance, you don't have other things, it affects you much more and the trauma can be much greater. Also, trauma exposures are, we see, as I said, about 30% of trauma in childhood, including about 19% child physical abuse, 24 to 28% child emotional abuse. I'm not going to go much into it, but when we break it down in these studies by physical, emotion, and sexual, emotional is generally our biggest risk factor. And we're not yet sure if that's truly because of the attachment components of emotional abuse, or if it's because emotional, when any of these other things happen, you essentially also get emotional abuse as well, so it sort of combines all of it. And if you just look at another sort of example of the rates of trauma in school-age children in these cohorts, again you see sort of normal levels of disaster and animal attack, but very high levels of things like assaults and seeing family members arrested, for example. Again, back to the idea of cycles of violence and cycles of trauma. So the issue with childhood trauma in an at-risk population is that we know childhood trauma is one of the biggest risk factors for all disorders, and a whole host of developmental studies separate across neurology and developmental pediatrics over decades has led us to know that there are critical periods of development such that in the both prenatally and in the early months of life, once developing the visual system, the hearing system, somatosensory system, learning to walk, all of those critical periods, and we know that that happens at specific time points. And similarly, language doesn't kick in until 1 to 2 years of age, but then it kicks in and goes gangbusters. And then higher cognitive functioning and Piaget's pathways and all of these come on at later ages. What's often historically not paid attention to, maybe because it's harder to measure, is that there are similar critical periods for emotional development. And at the same time that you're learning how to make cognitive components of the world throughout these periods, and we don't really know when exactly it is, but it's from probably infancy through adolescence, you're also creating emotional maps of the world. And we know now that there are parallel memory systems and parallel brain systems from cognition, emotion, etc. And the emotional the brain systems are developing in parallel, and attachment and all the other positive and negative emotions are equally affected by trauma as these other components and by developmental disruption. Lots of data from ACE studies and others. Some of these slides I'm showing you from the Center for the Developing Child, led by Chuck Nelson and others, again show that the more developmental risk factors and adverse child events, the more likely children are to have developmental delays. So again, thinking about at-risk populations, educational attainment and other problems, the more trauma that is heaped upon an at-risk population, the more you're going to shift the educational attainment and other risk factors. And again, all of this is treatable by treating trauma. Emotion recognition, here's a study by Pollock and all showing that compared to non-abused kids who were physically abused and neglected and were 3 to 5 year olds were tested on an emotional discrimination task. And this gets back to the emotional critical periods. The neglected children were less able to differentiate negative emotions on the subjective task, and the abused children over-identified anger. Again, were overly sensitive to anger. You can see the sort of flavors of PTSD in there, the generalization of fear, but you can also then see how that could lead, how that leads to an increased risk for a defensive response. Executive function. Executive functions being, defined as being able to focus, hold, work with information, filter distractions, etc. And all of these components are at risk with trauma. And data has shown, this is from Weintraub et al., that trauma impairs the development of executive function and top-down regulation. So child trauma affects all of these cognitive and emotional developmental components. And of course, we know now that increased rates of childhood trauma predict increased PTSD in adulthood from an adult trauma, and predict increased rates of depression, mood disorders, ADHD, and then other at-risk components for the cycles that we're talking about: oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, and substance abuse disorders. And often a lot of these in kids are misdiagnosed when it's really PTSD underneath the surface. Back to our case studies. Miss 8622 has 4 children. Her 8-year-old stays with her mother. The other children stay with her. She sounded annoyed by her own children. She said, "My kids aggravate me." She's really looking forward to having them stay with her mother for the summer. You can see her patience and tolerance level is hard. The woman with resilience, Miss 8523, though, we don't know. I'll tell you more about her in a minute, but she also has PTSD, and we know she has a 5-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. So another set of data I want to talk about is actually capturing data, trying to understand the kids at risk and what differentiates the kids at risk who go on to develop PTSD, depression, and externalizing behavior and conduct disorder versus those who are more resilient. And a number of years ago, the Grady Trauma Project began a second set of studies called the Parents and Child Program, led by Tanya Jovanovich and Beck Bradley, and with a whole host of collaborators, that really tries to understand, if we bring in moms who are highly traumatized with and without PTSD, and bring in their kids from about 8 to 12 years old, and then follow the kids through latency age and puberty, can we understand some of the risk factors, and can we understand where we can integrate and intervene with the trajectories. So this is an example of one physiological measure. So this is Gianna, who's the daughter of one of our PIs, and she's showing us how we measure physiology in kids. So she was about 7 or 8 at the time. She's showing on the hand we can measure galvanic skin response and heart rate and heart rate variability. We can also then measure eye blink. And so these are two EMG electrodes that measure the strength of an eye blink. And basically one common thing like we can do is measure the startle reaction, so just to an unexpected noise sound, and we can do that in the light and in the dark. And most people will have a little bit of an elevated in the dark because the basic idea of the startle reaction, and this was really discovered by Mike Davis and colleagues, it's the startle circuit starts both within the ears with the auditory cochlea going through the auditory nucleus, and then goes down to a brain region called the RPC. And this modulates the basic response, the blink response to a startle. However, that whole thing is being modulated by one of those direct projections from the amygdala. So when you're more afraid or more anxious or feel threatened, your startle response is higher. So for example, if you are walking down a dark alley and you hear an unexpected loud noise, you're going to have a much bigger startle response than if you're sitting quietly watching a webinar. So we can do this in patients, and what we also know is that people with PTSD have greater startle responses than those without. And so if you do the same startle cue in the light or dark, you'll get a larger startle in the dark. And this is all work in our group led by Seth Norhelm and Tanya Ivanovich. And what we find in our study is that mom's history of child abuse by itself is sufficient to lead to a much, or be associated with a much higher rate of dark enhanced startle in children compared to kids. I mean, to the mom's history with a low abuse. So even not accounting for any of the other issues, it's an example of the intergenerational risk of those with greater trauma histories having more risk themselves, and the next generation being more at risk for trauma-related symptoms. And in our case examples, the 8622, the risk mother, her kid had greater dark enhanced startle compared to the offspring of the non-risk. So another sidestep into biology. One example that is leading us to some of the best understanding of gene by environment interaction is a gene called FKBP5. And FKBP5 is a gene that plays a critical role in trauma-associated dysregulation. One of the best understood circuits related to stress and fear is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis. And in that case, the amygdala and BNST send projections with CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then sends CRH down to the pituitary gland, which then releases ACTH into the bloodstream, then activating cortisol, norepinephrine, aldosterone, and a whole host of downstream factors from stress-related factors. But cortisol feeds back into the hypothalamus and shuts down the system. Elizabeth Bender, Beck Bradley, and others showed initially in our group that a polymorphism for FKBP5 that's associated with differential glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity and increased feedback of the system was associated with more PTSD, particularly those with childhood trauma with a risk allele for FKBP5 were associated with much greater PTSD symptoms than those with childhood trauma with what later we went on to call a resilience allele. And this data has been replicated in many studies now, and Elizabeth Bender's put a recent meta-analysis together with almost 20,000 samples that have found effects of FKBP5 interacting with childhood trauma on adult outcomes like PTSD and depression. Another biological finding that we see frequently in PTSD is smaller hippocampal volumes. And this work came initially from Doug Bremner, who did a whole series of studies at Yale and Emory showing smaller hippocampal volume, as well as people like Roger Pittman have found these studies. Raj Mori, the leader of the PGC imaging group, has now shown in several thousand patients with Mark Logue in Boston, replicating smaller hippocampal volumes in a subset of these. Nagar Fani, an assistant professor at Emory, did work with the Grady Trauma Project samples showing differential hippocampal activation in those with PTSD versus those without, and more interestingly, smaller hippocampal volumes when we measured microcircuitry of the hippocampus. And Nagar, in a separate paper, showed using diffusion tensor imaging that measures white matter integrity, that the white matter tract between the hippocampus and the prefrontal regions was had less white matter integrity, if you will. The DTI signal for those with the risk allele of FKBP5 were associated with decreased white matter integrity. So both of these biological historical findings in PTSD, smaller hippocampal volume and decreased hippocampal connectivity, were associated with the risk allele of FKBP5, again, a gene associated with more stress response. Ahmad Hariri at Duke showed in a healthy population more amygdala activation with the risk allele for FKBP5 as well. So one, without going through a lot of the other data, but just to leave you with a sort of model for how to think about this, is that we can think about the amygdala as a highly conserved historical brainstem region that combines the external world and internal memories and helps us reflexively have either a stress response or be resilient and tolerant. And this is modulated by the hippocampus, the medial prefrontal cortex, etc. With developmental cortisol, I didn't show you this data, but there's data that's by Regina Sullivan and others showing that amygdala early during development switches its critical period, if you will, for switching to be afraid, switching to threat. It turns out in infants and very, very early in young rodents at least, the amygdala starts as only detecting positive, as only mediating approach behavior. But then at a certain time point in critical development, it switches from approach to avoidance and fear behavior. And that's mediated in part by levels of cortisol. I made the argument that FKBP5 is a critical modulator of cortisol level, so that early life, we can have a model then that early life stress, which activates cortisol at the right critical periods, acting on those who are biologically more at risk. And we don't think it's just one gene like FKBP5, that's merely an example. It's going to be a whole host of hundreds, if not thousands of genes that alters the stress response, can, through critical period development, lead to increased stress and fear, such that child abuse combined with biological risk factors may set up an amygdala-dependent circuit that's primed for stress responsiveness. That does not mean, however, that it's not reversible and not treatable. For our case studies, the risk mom said she described her relationship with her 15-year-old daughter as she can't stand me, her 16-year-old son is iffy, her 9-year-old as he loves me, her 8-year-old as he doesn't know me. But even the 9-year-old, who she said he loves me, she was surprised by her lack of warmth towards him. The resilient mom was inspired by her daughter's strong interest in reading. She states she wants to be a role model for her children as they grow up, and she's enrolled now in a program to get her GED. Upon completing her GED, she hopes to do work in child advocacy. So despite all of her trauma, she really is looking for how to change it for the next generation. In terms of next generations for treatments, I've talked a lot about the amygdala, and this is a nice graph from Kay Tai showing that the amygdala is conserved from lizards all the way to humans. We can track it in rodents. We know the circuits that are involved from the fear learning process through the automatic fear response. But there's a whole new set of studies that's suggesting much more fine detail about how the amygdala works. For example, there are specific cells within the amygdala, some of which we can think of as fear-on neurons and some of which as fear-off neurons, as exampled by Andreas Luthi. So that now as we start initially with thinking about the amygdala as maybe a few regions, or calling it the amygdala, now we understand there may be 15 regions, and now we understand that within each region there are tens if not hundreds of different kinds of cells. But with the molecular biology revolution, we can now start to target very specific cells in very specific regions of the amygdala and turn them on or off, and that then is leading us to a really precise understanding of how fear is working at a molecular cellular level, how it can become overgeneralized, or how the hippocampus can help you to discriminate, how the basolateral amygdala may mediate positive and negative fear pathways or fear-off pathways, and by doing that it may lead to a new set of targeted approaches with pharmacology to combine with psychotherapies like exposure-based psychotherapy and other critical approaches to make our treatments work better. I'm going to just walk through this just with the take-home point that there are now all sorts of approaches. In this case, Erin Jasnow and her group was able to take one of these specific fear-off cells and activate it with a technology called optogenetics, where we can just activate with a fiber optic specific cells in the brain. And what he did, when he did that, he was able to completely decrease or block fear acquisition in a mouse and specifically enhance fear extinction in a mouse. So by activating a very specific set of neurons, he could turn fear up or down in different ways. Kenneth McCullough in the lab identified a whole set of genes that were expressed specifically in this fear-off pathway, and he showed when he activated one of them, for example, the neurotensin 2 receptor that was co-expressed with the Thi1 fear-off cells, he identified this new potential drug, beta-lactotensin, that activates the neurotensin receptors, that essentially blocks fear expression. Again, showing that as a proof of concept that by understanding the fear circuits, we can identify new treatments. Okay, that's the last biology. Coming back to communities, we know there's a cycle of stress and trauma interacting with poverty that then increase the rates. And we and others are starting to look at community-based geocoding and other approaches to understand how these all interact. Study, again, led by Beck Bradley and a number of collaborators, also has been able to show that in our Atlanta cohort, that community cohesion is one resilience example that decreases PTSD symptoms, whereas neighborhood disorder is associated with it. And if we could find ways to interact with the mitigating aspects of neighborhood disorder and community cohesion, could one have interventions at a community level for increasing resilience as well. Overall, this concept of resilience is associated with social support. Again, it doesn't have to have everyone around the kid be great. It needs to have some caring adults that are really provide, whether it's a coach, a parent, a school teacher, etc., and having the resources for this. But there's a lot at risk in these communities. Poverty, results of racism, environmental exposures, toxicology exposures, trauma, and PTSD. And we're increasingly understanding how all of these together increase risk of defensive behavior that can be read as conduct disorder, substance abuse, and this lead to a cycle that can be very hard to break. And that with a medical model approach to these problems, we may be able to block this bad outcome and thus block the intergenerational. One example of things that are being done that I think are optimistic, Massachusetts is now embedding dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, in juvenile justice populations, providing incarcerated youth with the tools for focus on emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and behavioral management. As much as everyone agrees that our prison and jail systems should be, well, not everyone, I guess, should be places for rehabilitation, they're still, for the most part, places for punishment. And so we've got to take neuroscience and our understanding of trauma and bring it into these systems if we're ever going to stop the cycles of violence. Other ideas are, can we in school systems incorporate approaches like DBT, emotion regulation, mindfulness, and even education about emotion and defensive reactions into in elementary schools, into our health classes. How can we do these things? Again, emotional skills training is one way of thinking about improving top-down regulation of responding by cortical processes that enhance resilience and flexibility, increasing orbitofrontal activation and decreasing amygdala activation, with the overall goal being how, both through our pharmacological treatments, but even more importantly through our psychotherapy and community treatments, increase top-down regulation of amygdala response. And again, DBT and CBT, there's evidence they increase the ventromedial regulation of these amygdala responses, the hippocampal regulation of context, etc. And our current medications likely decrease some of the symptomatic responses, and maybe future medications, as we talked about, would directly target the circuits involved in the fear response, the aggression response, and help the plasticity between the top-down prefrontal and hippocampal systems and the downstream amygdala systems. So in summary, I've walked through the biology that interacts with the environment for a healthy developing brain, and reminded you that trauma in childhood is one of the largest risk factors for psychiatric disorders, but that PTSD is prevalent, and it's very prevalent in our at-risk populations, in our impoverished populations. Is associated with increased risk for substance abuse, decreased function, and associated with increased risk for violence. And all of this leads to a cycle that we think is amenable to a medical model approach. How can we think about our inner city kids, our jail systems, our communities from a medical model approach to treating trauma and intervening? And that understanding the neuroscience of fear and PTSD can help, and most importantly, PTSD can be treated. And if we can bring science to improve rehabilitation, for example, DBT, emotional skills training, and diversion systems and mental health courts, as well as how can we bring these to help train resilience in elementary schools, are all possibilities. I've walked you through a whole host of work, but again, I'm really just the cheerleader. I want to particularly point out Beck Bradley, Tanya Ivanovich, Ricky Gillespie, Nagar Fani, and a whole host of great collaborators at the Grady Trauma Project who've been behind this work. And I showed some of the biological work of Kim McCullough, Aaron Jasnow, and others. So at this point, thank you very much. I'll take questions and leave you with the CE code for this course.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ressler, for this exciting and excellent presentation. We're now going to begin answering the questions that have been submitted. And as a reminder to everybody, you can still submit questions to the chat panel in your attendee control panel. Dr. Ressler, there was one question about, you mentioned future medications. Could you develop that point a little bit, please?
Sure, yeah, I went through that pretty quickly. The idea here is that as we understand these different cell populations that really drive the autonomic reflexive fear response, that instead of all of our medications in psychiatry that we currently use today were all serendipitously discovered. There is not yet one that is based on biology that was built upon our understanding of the neurobiology of a psychiatric disorder. We are now in the area in amygdala-based disorders, fear-based disorders, that we are maybe within grasp of drugs that are specifically targeting the plasticity in the amygdala. You could imagine blocking the initial trauma response after when somebody comes into the emergency room, prevent PTSD from ever developing, or enhancing the extinction or fear off neurons in the amygdala so that they respond better to therapy. That's just the very beginning of the tip of the iceberg. The idea is that by having a cell circuit model approach to understanding these processes, new treatments are on the cusp.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ressler. Another question was about the improved rehabilitation you were mentioning of juvenile systems. Is there an example that might come to mind you could share with the audience?
Yeah, so again, there's data now in DBT in the juvenile systems in Massachusetts, and if somebody wants to send me an email, happy to put you in touch with the people doing this work, where they're bringing trained clinicians and therapists into the juvenile justice system for kids, adolescents in the Massachusetts juvenile system, and doing DBT therapy, DBT training in the juvenile system. And I think for those familiar with DBT, you can see very quickly how having training and skills for emotion dysregulation would be very helpful for kids at risk when they get back out on the street and somebody yells at them, says something to them, does whatever, activates a defensive response that then gets them in trouble again, how those skills could be remarkably helpful in stopping that cycle.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ressler. Here is another question. You were discussing some of the research of Dr. Bradley and factors that improve resilience. Is there any research that may show that even though some may not be exposed to having those resilience factors, that their part of the brain, the amygdala, may make them, may help them be more resilient?
There's very little neurobiology work on resilience yet. It's certainly an area of great interest. We and others are doing genetic studies of resilience. It's certainly an area of excitement. I think there's some hypotheses and maybe a little bit of data suggesting that greater prefrontal activation to a choice task, that generally greater cognitive flexibility, that greater top-down control of emotion are all components with resilience. So I think based on our cognitive understanding of what resilience is, you can make predictions that seem to somewhat hold up in terms of the neural circuits associated with those. But I think the field is just very early, but I think it raises the question of most of our psychiatric disorders that we use treatments for, we're not, at least currently, targeting the underlying disorder. We're not targeting the underlying pathology. For example, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, we know now that depression, or at least 99% of depression, is not a serotonin deficit, et cetera. So, but what it does is probably increase resilience in some ways. And so as we shift that thinking to increasing resilience may be a transdiagnostic way of helping people in a broad framework, and that's exactly what DBT is, for example. DBT is basically providing a new set of coping strategies and emotional skills, and of course that's just one of many kinds of great cognitive behavior therapies that are being used now. Those are all, I would argue, not treating the broken thing, but helping provide the brain with a new coping mechanism to help deal with stress.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ressler. I think our time has come up. We do not have any more questions at this point. I am...
Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. We would very much like to thank you, Dr. Ressler, And as well as all the participants who attended today's webinar, you will be receiving a follow-up email within an hour that includes a link to the evaluation and link to the recording of the webinar. Please do share your thoughts even if you're not requesting C. We hope to all see you at the Anxiety and Depression Conference 2018, beginning of April in Washington, D.C. And on behalf of ADAA and our presenter, thank you very much for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.